So I looked at Garrett Kaiser's Getting Schooled, The Reeducation of the American Teacher. And in this book, a lot of what Geiser talks about is the comparison from when he was teaching in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont 14 years ago and what it's like now as he returns to be a teacher for 1 year. And so one of the things that he talks about is the introduction of a lot of new technology and standard systems within the schools that are created to uh, make things easier, make things more efficient, and be able to collect a lot of data to make sure that people are meeting their marks. But what Geiser talks about in comparing how things used to be to how they are now, it's taking away from the natural interactions between teachers and students and the spontaneous discussions that can happen with having this kind of obsession of meeting their marks and meeting the standard requirements. Having to collect all of this data is actually taking up a lot of time and adding a level of formality in the natural day-to-day interactions between teachers and students, which talking about actually taking away from the experience of being a student and being a teacher. Another theme that Kaiser talks about in his book is something that has not changed since his hiatus of being a teacher, which is that the level of poverty in the rural area of Vermont that he's teaching in, and the lifestyle and stress of the day-to-day life of the students and how it's impacting their ability to engage in their education. And so he talks about how that's very familiar to when he was a teacher 14 years ago, and that the same kind of kids are coming in with the same kind of stressful situations at home. Drug use, having to pick up work, having to wake up early and work on the farm before they come into work, before they come into school, and on top of all of that, often living below the poverty line, and how that type of stress is impacting um, the way kids are coming into school. Although that hasn't changed, he talks about how the way it's being addressed has changed and how he kind of goes back and forth in the book a little bit about um, how he feels for these kids, and sometimes he feels like he wishes he could do more about their home life. How um, he talks about the statistics of the difference between a somebody living in above the poverty line and below the poverty line is something like 30 million words by a certain age, and how he really wishes that he could just catch these kids up and really provide for them and overcompensate for what they're lacking with what they're learning at home. Uh, and then he also talks about how sometimes he feels like, yes, it's important to consider that these students have a really difficult life at home, and what they're experiencing there is impacting their ability to, reach their potential as students. But are schools being too soft about that? Are they lowering their expectations of what students should be doing because they're considering so much what the students are having to deal with at home? And I kind of see him going back and forth a little bit his his writing, because he talks about sometimes he wishes he could give kids a ride home. He could give them an extra meal or something like that. But then he talks about how is pushing back deadlines and accepting late work or being okay with kids having these excuses, is that helping them, or is it just um, kind of setting them up for an unrealistic leniency for when they're out of school? Um, and that's kind of something that I've thought about too. And it's a very familiar um, kind of mindset that I've come across as an educator in rural Vermont, where I hear teachers and other adults just saying, well, that's not how things used to be. You know, we never used to hold these kids' hand through all of these different problems, and they were impacted. It seemed like the problems that we're seeing today with behaviors and things like that, they didn't exist back in the day. So I hear that a lot, and I also hear people, certain teachers that feel like it's ridiculous that a student should be congratulated for doing such a minimal amount of work at times. And that's difficult for me in what I do, because I work not in the academic realm, but side by side with it, working through having kids process through the things that they're carrying in from their home life, what the difficult night the night before has, um, how that's going to impact their day to day, and also really kind of putting in perspective. It's it's kind of like comparing the student to themselves instead of comparing the student to the other 20 students in the class. Some of these kids are coming in, staying in a hotel with in a dangerous situation, not sleeping well, not eating well, not really having the support from home, and then they come into school with severe behavior and emotional needs, and they're finally in class for a half an hour of the day, which is huge compared to what they have been doing, which is skipping school or having to be in the whatever disciplinary area there is in that school. And so you go to a teacher and you try to have them really like build that up, like, oh yeah, they're in school, look, they wrote one sentence. And teachers sometimes can have a really difficult time realizing that that's a big deal for that student. And I guess I could understand from an outsider's perspective how it seems like, because making a big deal and really praising a student for that little bit of work they did might be setting the bar too low and actually giving them a disservice in that way, instead of really holding them to the same standards as their classmates. But from what I've seen, you need to start somewhere, and it's not often going to be at the same point that everybody else is at. Um, so I kind of disagree with some of what he talks about with really holding all of his students to a really high standard with their academics and engagement of the type of literacy that he's teaching and the books that he's reading and things like that. One interesting idea that Kaiser talked about in his book, well, he was talking about how there's often a disconnect in a student's perspective of the work that they need to put in as a student and their work ethic in general. Like, for example, he's teaching in high school, and how a lot of these kids, they'll wake up at 4:30 in the morning, work on the farm, or they'll go to work after school at McDonald's and really show a high level of work ethic and willingness to work hard. But when it comes to getting the work done in school, it's there's a disconnect. They don't really understand what's in it for them. What's the point of this? And that is very, I think, reasonable questions to ask. And I think that I see that in students in elementary school, middle school, high school, and also when I was in public school. I definitely felt that way at times, especially in high school where I was taking just general courses, nothing really specifically catered to what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, and wondering why I was still trying to learn these high levels of math that I wasn't really planning on using in my life and haven't since. And uh, so what he talks about is that he notices that as well, is that just because these students are not performing and demonstrating their work ethic in school does not mean that it doesn't exist within them. And that can be really frustrating, as he expresses, as a teacher, where it's like, why aren't you just giving this your all? You know, why aren't you giving this assignment everything that you got? And so he said an idea that I was like, huh, never really thought about that, was the idea of paying students for their work. And so I thought about that idea a little bit, about what would it be like if students got paid to participate in this system, um, and how that kind of makes a lot of sense. Uh, if we're insisting that these kids come in, and yes, there's a lot of payoff for graduating with a high school degree, there is that disconnect, and oftentimes throughout the years when they're trying to learn, they're not they're not fully engaged in it, because it's something that they're being basically force fed. So they're oftentimes in public schools, they're not really having the choice of what avenues they want to learn um, through, and what different topics they really want to concentrate on. They just have to engage in whatever the teacher is providing for them. And so that, on top of really not seeing any results from that, other than just the natural reinforcement of being in the classroom and being congratulated by their teachers and having friends, um, they're not really seeing anything for all of the work that they're putting in. And that can be difficult for, I think, a lot of students. I think that's what we're seeing in these rural areas and different places, even like inner city areas. Well, if I do this, I'm going to make all of this money. Why am I concentrating on doing this other thing that I'm not getting anything out of? And is not really preparing me for the type of life that I'm expected to have. And I think that those are really important things to think about with bringing the realistic expectations of certain populations in certain areas, and realizing that just putting sweeping standards for all different areas, different states, different counties to have to meet, um, and not really taking into consideration the different interests and um, job opportunities that those areas have, is not really serving the population as well as it should.